So this segment is about health and human rights. I recommend the book The Human Right to Health by Jonathan Wolfe, and on the very first page you'll find this quote. He says, "Being imprisoned for a lengthy period without trial, everyone would agree, is a violation of human rights. But it would be a joke, and not a very funny one, to assert that your rights had been violated by several months of unexpected foul weather." Then he asks, is suffering from ill health more like wrongful imprisonment or more like inhospitable climate? So what do you think? Essentially, he's asking, is ill health a human rights violation? As you're considering that, I'd like to share this example. Moline Mudimu died of AIDS in Zimbabwe in 2006. She suffered a great deal in the last year of her life. The antiretroviral drugs that would have relieved her suffering and prolonged her life were available at the pharmacy just down the street from her. She couldn't pay for them, so she suffered and died. She died because of a set of other people's decisions about the pricing of drugs, patent laws, and economic policy, national priorities, and international sanctions. Is this a violation of her human rights? It may beg the question, who even determines what human rights are? And that brings us to the United Nations. You've heard of the UN before. In April 1945, representatives of 50 nations met in San Francisco with the aim of setting up the UN, and this was designed as an international forum to deal with disputes among nations, and their hope was that they could prevent future world wars. This was an attempt to come together and find some commonality. So in 1948, 3 years after they joined together, they finally wrote what we call now the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you do an internet search for Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will find tons of articles, tons of videos, all kinds of information, lots of websites. There's so much out there to take in related to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But essentially, these countries that came together all had to agree on it. So 58 countries at the time were eligible to vote. 48 of them approved of the document. 8 of them abstained from voting at all. 2 just weren't present for the vote. But no one, not a single country, voted against the document. So the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are also available online. You can follow the link, or you can just search for this on your own, but it will likely take you to the same document, the signed Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So let's go beyond the UDHR, because UDHR is not legally binding. It's a document that just says, yeah, we all agree to this, but if anyone violates it, frankly, there's not a whole lot that the UN can do with that alone, because it's not legally binding. So 1954 came and the UN drafted 2 covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So 12 years after being drafted, both of these covenants were finally adopted by the UN, and most countries were happy to sign the first one, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, because it mostly made promises of what we call non-interference. It mostly made promises that a country's state government would not get involved with things they didn't need to be involved with. They wouldn't get in the way of anyone's human rights. Still, there are 6 countries who have not signed the second one, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this one is seen as slightly different because it really does require that some countries take action that perhaps they're not prepared to take. This covenant includes directly the right to health. It specifically names that people have a right to be healthy. And it even discusses, in a lot of articles to follow, things like the right to food, shelter, clean water, etc. Do you know which countries are on that list of 6 who will not sign that? Well, you may be surprised by at least one of these. This is the list of countries who have not ratified the covenant. And, maybe the first 5, I'm not sure what you think about those, whether they surprise you or not. But most students tell me that number 6 surprises them quite a bit. Number 6 says the United States of America. We often like to think of ourselves in the United States as leaders in the world. We like to be the first to do things. We like to set an example for others to follow. And in this case, we are on the very short list of countries who will not make the promise to our own citizens to a right to health. So there are other covenants that came later. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC. Every country in the world has ratified this except 2. Can you guess which 2? Well, you see there, United States and Somalia. The only 2 countries in the world who won't sign it. The United States claim that ratifying this document would threaten some of our domestic policy, which is a rather vague claim. President Barack Obama has called our lack of action on the CRC embarrassing and promised to address it, but to this point we are still on that list of 2 countries that have not signed it. The second one here is CEDAW, Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. This is a treaty that sets forth the rights of women, and again, the United States has not ratified this one. Many people who block this in the United States and say, no, we shouldn't be signing CEDAW, claim that this would threaten things that we have strict policies on related to same-sex marriage, legal prostitution. There's no evidence of either of those things. Others would argue that if we sign a document saying that we will eliminate discrimination against women, that our government would be forced to enforce things like equal pay for women. And so far, in our government, we haven't had that. So, after all that, do you believe health is a human right? Well, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, does not specifically address health as a human right, but Article 25(1) states that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services. So some might say that directly reflects a right to health. Others say it's a little bit more indirectly, but I'll bet we can all agree that the UDHR does make mention of health. The problem, though, and I said this before, is that the UDHR is not legally binding. That brings us to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This is the one that the United States has not and will not sign. But there, Article 12 addresses the human right to health in great detail. It says everyone has the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Specifically, the covenant states that governments must reduce infant mortality, improve the environment, address disease prevention as well as treatment, create conditions in which would ensure medical services. So those who have ratified that document have agreed that health is a human right. Those who have not ratified it have not signed to agree that health is a human right. And in many ways, that's how in our country we get away with having folks lacking access to health care. One thing that is important, though, the human right to health is a well-established part of international law, even if some countries, like our own, have not specifically endorsed it. That means the United Nations can hold a country responsible if the citizens are not able to achieve a minimal standard of health. And so, signing or not, the United Nations can take action if the situation is severe enough. Now, in our case, the United States, where we have a lot of people who lack access to health care, the United Nations has not yet found it to be severe enough to intervene, especially if you consider that there are countries all over the world in far worse situations than we are in the United States. So it's very likely that we are not a high priority for the UN to take any kind of action, but we'll have to wait and see what happens with the future of our government. So I just want to make a note here about human rights as a framework. In the public health course, we talk a lot about looking at public health problems through different lenses, through a different pair of eyes. And so if we focus on just the human rights framework, it's important to know what that means. So the human rights framework focuses on the impacts of health policies, programs, and practices on human rights, and how the violation of human rights can have a negative effect on one's health, and how health and human rights act in synergy. And what that last one means is we often find that where other human rights are violated, health can suffer, and vice versa. Where health suffers, other human rights tend to be violated. So here's just a quote from Jonathan Mann, 1999. He says, "The human rights approach seeks to describe and then to promote and protect the societal level prerequisites for human well-being in which each individual can achieve his or her full potential." Here I just have some recommended readings. I already mentioned The Human Right to Health by Jonathan Wolfe. Another great one by Paul Farmer is Pathologies of Power. Amartya Sen wrote Development is Freedom. Paulo Freire wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And finally, you can find on the internet an open journal called Health and Human Rights that you'll have access to yourself.